there's two things to understand with the diagram, right? You have to understand why the diagram exists, right? In some sense, the diagram, the ERD, is an optional thing, right? You could jump into the code and write it without doing the ERD. Is that clear? Like that is totally possible, okay? The ERD serves two purposes. For one, or three in our case, one is that it helps to document what you're doing, right? It serves as the primary form of documentation of your system. Does that make sense? So it's a way to document it so you know later about the choices that you made, and it also informs your decision and potentially your team's decision about building the application as a whole, right? It's a centralized store of that information, which is a lot more accessible than looking at the code oftentimes, okay? So that's one part of it, it's documentation, okay? From the documentation side, the documentation is constantly in iteration, right? So the reality is from the documentation perspective, it doesn't need to be at that point until you're done with it, okay? It might be that you do a first iteration and you kind of do a rough draft of the ERD. You start writing some code, and then as you're writing code, you constantly update that ERD. That's okay. I often find myself doing it, okay? The other side that it fits, the other side where it exists, is to try and accelerate the process as a whole, right? Doing a little bit of planning up ahead of time, let's say you do 2 hours of planning, that can easily save you 8 hours of work. And that's why I ask you to do it first. Does that make sense? It's to try and accelerate the rest of your work you're doing. But if you take so much time on the diagram that you don't get to writing any code, then you haven't really gained the benefit of that diagram. Does that make sense? If you spend 8 hours creating the diagram, it wasn't worth it creating the diagram. If you spend 2 hours creating the diagram, it's worth your time, okay? So there's a threshold there where you need to, at some point, you have to say, the diagram is good enough, I'm going to start writing code, and I'm going to come back and fix the diagram. Cool? As I keep going. So that's one thing I would stress. Next time you're doing these diagrams, don't try to get it perfect before you start writing the code. Cool? Don't try to get it perfect before you start writing code. And recognize that you can iterate on it. The other thing it does, at least from my perspective, it gives me a view on what decisions and plans that you're going to make. So I kind of know where you're going, the direction that you're going, and I can potentially head off some pitfalls before you get there, right? So that's part of that. And one of the things that means is the sooner you can finish it and the sooner you can upload it, whether to Git or to inside Ranken, the sooner you put it in there, the sooner I can give you feedback, right? So again, the goal with the ERD is you want to do it as fast as possible.